interview our principal, Mr. Carl Robert, to gather his thoughts and opinions about language and communication with the blind, deaf, and autistic people. So, which nationality do you belong to?
I'm British.
Okay. Do you believe that sign language is as efficient as speech, and why?
So, I don't think I know enough about sign language to give an expert opinion on it, but my feeling is that I don't think it is going to be quite as efficient as normal speech. The reason I say that is that if it was a better way of communicating, then probably we would all be using it, wouldn't we? We wouldn't bother using our speech. And my observations are that probably it's harder, it's not quite as quick to communicate in sign language as perhaps you could using other speech. But like I said, I'm not an expert, so I might be completely wrong on that, but that's my thoughts.
Okay. Do you think that being blind would restrict a person from being a pilot, sports person, chef, doctor, and so on? If not, what do you think can be done?
Okay, I think you can do all of those things if you are blind, and that includes flying an aeroplane, because it has been done by blind people. Undoubtedly, it's harder because you've got that extra restriction, but with the right support, the right technology, some help from somebody else, there's no reason why a blind person shouldn't do all of those things. But clearly it's going to be more difficult.
How would you communicate to a person with autism?
So, as you know, if somebody is autistic, they can misinterpret language, and particularly when you are implying things. Implication and metaphors don't quite work as well for autistic people. And so you need to be very explicit with your language, very clear and very direct, and sometimes talk in a way that you or I may feel a bit rude and a bit direct, but unless you're very clear and direct with autistic people, they won't always understand what you're trying to say. Let me give you an example. I once told an autistic child in a science lesson, could you draw a table, please? And what I meant, of course, was a scientific table with headings and columns, etc. What he drew was a physical table. And that's my fault, because I wasn't explicit enough in telling him and understanding his disability and telling him what he should be doing in the lesson. And you know, I consider that my fault, not his fault, my fault for not being clear. So you've got to be very explicit, very clear when you're speaking with autistic people.
Do you think that sign language and Braille should be added in our educational system, and why?
Definitely yes, for two reasons really. One, it builds an awareness for those who are not deaf and not blind. It builds an awareness of the challenges around those disabilities. And secondly, it will help us communicate with each other, because we're all going to come across people who are either deaf or blind, or who have other disabilities, and the better we can communicate, those of us who don't have those disabilities, the better we can communicate, the better it is for everyone.
Yeah. Do you feel that kindness is a language that all must use to communicate with the blind, deaf, and people with autism, or that such language is unnecessary?
I found this a really interesting question, and I probably need to understand the question a bit more. But my initial response is that I believe that kindness should be used towards all human beings, regardless of their ability or disability. I'm interested in the concept of kindness as a language. Can you explain that, what you mean by that?
We were actually inspired by this quote by Mark Twain. He said that blindness is a language that the deaf can hear.
You mean kindness?
So, what did I say?
You said blindness.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay, go ahead.
So kindness is a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see. So even our topic name is kindness as a language, because many times people think that they're blind, they're deaf, so we'd rather ask someone else to communicate with them, or we'll just just find another way out rather than actually trying and communicating with them. They see their disability as an obstacle, which shouldn't be seen as one. So, and it's prevalent. We've taken surveys and we've seen quite few responses. That's why we have chosen kindness as a language.
Okay, I love that concept, and now that you've explained it, I understand. We need to do everything we can to break down barriers, to make sure that people who don't have disabilities understand what it's like to have a disability, and understand how to help people overcome those disabilities. So I would hate to think that somebody doesn't speak to a blind person or a deaf person just simply because they don't know how to. We must overcome that, and education, schools have a big part to play, don't they, in making sure that we understand how to communicate with all sorts of people with different abilities and disabilities. And kindness, that's a nice way of putting it, kindness as a language is a really, really interesting concept. But I think it goes a bit further. If we don't educate people in our society properly, then they are never going to know how to overcome the barriers that may exist between us.
The people who are blind, deaf and autistic are constantly trying to adapt to our world. How important is it for you to make an effort to try and adapt to their world?
Absolutely essential. Every single one of us has a duty to do everything we can to adapt to other people's worlds. And I say that not just about people who are disabled, but there are things like cultural differences. We must always try to adapt to other people's way of thinking. So just as important for disabilities as it is for cultural differences, religious differences, all of those differences. It really ties in nicely with the Year of Tolerance, doesn't it? Absolutely, really important. And we are only ever going to get to a better place where there is more equality if those of us who are able-bodied adapt ourselves to the way of doing things for less able people. And we must, all of us have a duty to do that.
Some people say that disability is inability. What are your views on it?
It's an interesting thought. I disagree with that. Again, I've said it already, but what we must be doing in our society is looking to find ways to support disabled people with determination, to overcome the challenges that they face. And I see no reason, if we all give a bit of thought to this, the whole of society, governments and everyone in that society gives some thought, there is no reason why disabilities cannot be overcome.
And lastly, in your opinion, what are the changes some countries need to make to accept the blind, deaf and autistic rather than excluding them?
Okay, so as I said already, it starts with education. We need to understand what it's like to be autistic, or what it's like to be blind, or what it's like to be deaf. And that starts in schools, in society. So a greater understanding is the first thing. The second thing is to make sure people not just understand the disability, but also understand how they can help other people overcome their disabilities, how they can support. And thirdly, there are some physical changes that we need to make within every country to make them more accessible to people without sight or for people who can't hear. So for example, for those without sight, we need to look at ways in which we can use sound to help people navigate their way around the world. For we need to look at the structure, so things like do we have slopes in the right place? Are our pavements set up so that somebody without sight can navigate their way around? There are all sorts of physical changes we need to make. And technology is going to help us more and more with that as we go into the future. And I'm a big believer that technology can overcome most challenges. And I think that we will see ourselves in a place in the next 50 years, certainly, where we've used technology to overcome all of these disabilities that we've spoken about. In terms of autism, I think the biggest challenge there is helping the whole of society understand autism and understand that when you speak to an autistic person, you won't always get the response that you're expecting. And that doesn't mean that they're rude or that they're uneducated or whatever. It's their disability that's making this happen. And I think all too often we take, when somebody with autism interacts with us, we automatically assume that they're being rude. And that's because we don't understand autism. As I said, I've spent a lot of time with autistic children, and I've learnt to just interpret what they're saying from their point of view rather than from my point of view. And so, for example, let me give you an example. An autistic child, I need a haircut at the moment, okay, so my hair's a mess, isn't it? Now, you might say, oh no sir, no, your hair's fine, because you're being polite. An autistic child would say, yes, your hair looks horrible. Now, I've learned to interpret that as not rudeness, but a function of the autism. So the more we educate people, the more they can see things through other people's eyes, the better it's going to be for all of society.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
You're welcome.
And we've gathered a lot of your opinions, so thank you so much, sir.
It's an absolute pleasure, anytime.